I might just start talking while Liz is gathering the questions there. I wanted to just something that's from Sue's talk. First of all, while I've got the microphone, I'm going to actually take this opportunity to congratulate Liz on getting this all together and her role in that. So she thanks everyone else. Someone needs to thank her. It's going to be me. It's actually going to be all of us.
That's very kind, John. It's a team effort, and I'm very heavily dependent on the people sitting up here on this stage and on many of the people in the room. And welcome Marina, who's going to be one of our speakers later today. So if any of the questions are relevant to you, you might be tapped. Now, just wanted to double check where the microphones are. I saw a loose one on the desk. Oh, you've got it there. So if there are any questions from the audience, perhaps Catherine, if you want to grab it and maybe give it to Desma. Desma's offered to run it around. So this is really, many people say in their feedback, the most interesting or enjoyable part of the day, in that it's a real chance for any questions. There's no such thing as a silly question to be asked, and we really couldn't have assembled a better group of people to try and tackle some of these questions. So thank you very much for the questions. If there are any that you haven't given to me yet, just pop them up onto this table and I'll include them. Now, this one actually, anyone in the panel might be able to comment on this. It's a very global question. Is treatment in Australia as advanced as in other countries? So I'm happy to really sort of just have anyone that would like to comment on that. John, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so from the surgeon's perspective, I think the answer is fundamentally yes. Some of the technologies, like I talked about intraoperative MRI, that's not available in a widespread setting in Australia, but there are also many units. I guess there's a percentage of the units, then probably we have just as many IMRIs as anywhere else, and there's certainly a leap. It's a technology you have to really believe in for it to be used. In terms of what I was talking about with resecting all of the MRI abnormality. In terms of the intraoperative fluorescence I was mentioning, that's widely available, although there's issues with funding that are not completely, resolved. So. And in terms of much of the other technology about which I was speaking, it's all sort of very widely available. How does that reflect on surgical treatment? I personally think that we do as good a job of surgery as anywhere in the world.
Okay. How-Wen, you've spent some time in Canada. Have you noticed any things we don't have or do have, or any comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, so I spent 3 years in Toronto not that long ago. I think in terms of clinical care, in terms of chemotherapy delivery and care, that are as good as anywhere in Australia in terms of clinical care. I think we're very good phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. Probably the only difference would be in the more very early phase, preclinical translational phase 1, that probably there's more variety of early innovative technologies that might be available first up in North America, for example, but as they move into later stages, I think a lot of the bigger trials we are involved in anyway.
Kerry, you run a lab. Are you jealous of any of your overseas laboratories, sort of
Not
scientists? Really. How do you think the science in neuro-oncology stacks up in Australia versus other labs?
I think you need to realise that we've had more Nobel Prize winners per capita than anywhere else in the world. So. We're certainly not backwards in the way that we do our research, and particularly translational research. So I think we are as competitive, if not more competitive, than our international counterparts. And also we've got the benefit too, if they're working on something good, is that we join them. So it's as simple as that. We're part of large international consortiums where we all work together, and it's a great community.
Michael, as a neuropathologist, I know that we're just recently campaigning to have certain studies reimbursed by the government is there anything you'd like to say about the way neuropathology and molecular testing is performed in Australia?
Well, certainly we have the opportunity to do molecular testing. It may not be as widely available as in some other countries, but you get a very slanted approach or slanted view of the quality of healthcare in a lot of other countries, because you only hear about the really good stuff. So coming out of America, you've got these fabulous new techniques, new surgical techniques, new trials. Whereas if you speak to the people that actually work and live in America, a lot of areas do much worse than we do. Certainly in terms of the pathology, a lot of what we do is based on immunohistochemical stains to look for particular markers in tumours. And in some places in America, they're very limited in terms of what they're allowed to do in terms of cost and things. So in terms of the pathology, we do as well as places overseas. And there's also the issue of whether we should really be an early adopter of, say, new, certainly pathological techniques, where it's very tempting when you read a journal article which says that this is the great new marker for a particular tumour. Now, that's usually in a research setting, and putting that into a clinical setting is quite different. It needs different controls, you've got a different population, so you can't translate what you read in a research paper immediately into the clinic. So I think it's important that we see what's happening overseas, but realise that it's not always the best policy to immediately adopt stuff. And I think in Australia we do this very well. Our neuropathology is as good as anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm concerned.
And what I alluded to a moment ago, so in the 2016 revamp of the WHO classification, certain disease entities are now defined by things like IDH, 1P19Q.
Yeah, one issue, of course, which is a universal issue around the world, is who pays for the tests. Some of the tests are quite expensive. Currently, the government is not paying for nearly all genetic tests in neuro-oncology. That will change. The government's being lobbied by various organisations, including the College of Pathologists. But until that happens, there is a cost issue about who pays for the various tests. But that's also the issue overseas in other countries.
And Stu, any comment you'd like to make?
So I would say it's similar to surgery in that Australian centres are on par in terms of the technology and the treatment that I spoke about in my presentation. I guess the only difference, as Michael's saying, is in large academic centres, they may have more access to specific equipment, but that is very specialised and only for selected patients. And as some of you may know, there's the whole era of proton therapy, which is a different type of radiation therapy available in an increasing number of North American, European and Asian centres, and that will come to Australia. It is coming to Australia, but it's not here yet, and that does have an indication, particularly in some childhood and adolescent tumours and some brain and spine tumours.
But also currently, certainly for proton beam, for cases where it's relevant and required, the government will pay for that.
Correct.
Yes. So it's not as though we're left out.
That's right. There is an international medical treatment overseas program where the government sponsors people and families to go overseas to access that treatment. Correct.
Jonathan.
I just wanted, I was going to move on to something else that kind of came up that probably I didn't talk about in my talk that I think might be a question some of you have. And Sue talked about re-irradiation. So probably I didn't cover, but probably I should have covered re-operation. So when might we re-operate? And again, the issues are actually very similar to with radiation. So obviously with radiation, where it's different is that the brain can only tolerate a certain amount of radiation, whereas theoretically we could operate as many times as we wanted. But the other factors in terms of how long it takes for tumour to progress or recur, the pathology of what it is, and therefore what we expect might happen next, and how the patient is. They're the main sort of, I guess, factors, just the wheres and the whens, really, exactly like Sue said. So I just thought that kind of occurred to me as Sue was speaking, and I thought I'd bring it up in the panel because it might be a question that some of you had.
I'm just going to quickly move to a question that again relates to Australia versus other opportunities in other countries. So I might go to either Sue or How-Wen. Can you get Optune in Australia, and how does it work? So if whoever wants to lean in and tell us about Optune or Novo TTF. So
That's interesting. So Nova TTF is available in North America, so that was something that patients could potentially get when I was in overseas fellowship. It's not a device that's licensed in Australia, so it's not something that you can administer in Australia, even if you wanted to pay for it. As you may be aware, there have been randomized trials looking at this technology, and I guess the pivotal trial suggested that there may be survival benefit with this technology, but the benefit is marginal, and there are some considerations to take into account. The logistics and also the pricing is very high, and I guess that has been one of the drawbacks to widespread adoption, I think.
And just to add to that, I did ask that very question to the pharmaceutical company at one of the international meetings, and my read of his answer was that Australia being a fairly small population overall, I think their business model didn't have any immediate plans to include, Australia, which I think is a real shame. And as Halben was saying, I think, the technical setup of the equipment and the ongoing maintenance would mandate that patient family being in that North American or European setting, and clearly for most families that is just not feasible. So I think it just goes probably to the first question about the ability of Australian patients and families to access new technologies and treatments in Australia.
So it's a shame we don't have a slide to show you, but it's quite a commitment to undergo Optune. So Novo TTF, the TTF stands for tumour treating fields, and it's basically flip-flopping of electric fields within the sort of the brain tumour. And patients basically have to shave their head, and they wear sort of little sticky sort of electrodes, which they have to wear at least 22 hours out of 24. And they can connect it via a rucksack to the device, which is doing which has got the electricity. I think they're trying to come up with some sort of belt holder device as well. It's very expensive. It's approximately 100,000 American a month, I think. So it's sort of certainly over $1 million a year. There are benefits in progression-free and overall survival, but not home run. It's very sort of similar in amount to, say, the addition of temozolomide. Sorry, John, go ahead.
All I was going to say is I saw a guy with one of these on in a lounge at an airport, so I'm not quite sure how he got through security with this thing with all these wires strapped to him and strapped to his head. But it was pretty impressive nonetheless. It did look, again, this is one of these things where there has to be a clear benefit for it to be adopted, and I don't think anyone believes that that's the case. Yeah.
And Australia, sort of certainly for the MBS and the PBS, has a very rigorous approach to sort of working out the cost-benefit analysis in terms of the money out versus the benefit back. All right, the next question is, again, more of a general one. Is brain cancer hereditary, and what's the latest thinking about the genetics of brain tumours? So, Michael, would you like to just make any sort of comment about? Yeah.
In general, the common brain tumours are not genetic, so astrocytomas or the high-grade astrocytomas. There are some genetic markers which may slightly bias you towards getting a tumour, but it's of only slight bias. Certainly for some hereditary tumour syndromes, like, say, neurofibromatosis, certain brain tumours are associated with that. So tumours involving the optic nerve in children, in people that have neurofibromatosis type 1, or people that have neurofibromatosis type 2, which is a completely different genetic disease, get tumours in their acoustic schwannomas, so they can have deafness and ringing in their ears and balance problems, and they can also get meningiomas. So the vast majority of tumours are not genetically based, but there are uncommon genetic syndromes that can result in increased brain tumours.
Jonathan.
Just to kind of break that down a little bit. So when we think about tumours and we talk about genetic testing and genetic markers, I guess there's two sides to genetics. There's the genetics that are inherited things. So the reason that, I look the same and I walk the same as my dad, is there's that side of genetics, and there are those tumour syndromes that are passed down from generation to generation, which is what Michael was talking about, neurofibromatosis and a whole bunch of others, and there are tumours that are associated with them. By their very nature, tumours anywhere in the body, brain tumours being no exception, are genetic, in that it's the information that makes one cell turn into its type of a cell that goes haywire, and that's why tumours develop. So what's important is that we talk about the genetics of tumours and genetic markers, but that doesn't mean that things are going to then be passed on. We're really talking about the things that have meant that the tumours developed. And that's why we often, rather than using the term genetic testing as such, we use the term molecular markers, because that implies the small parts of the cells that have changed so that things develop into tumours.
Yes, in most cancers, it's about somewhere like 5 to the most 10%, depending on the type of tumour, that's an inherited syndrome as such. And as Jonathan's just said, yes, there are genetic changes within the tumour, but that does not mean that it's an inherited problem. But of course, we're learning more and more about the differences between all of us, and we have what we call different genetic polymorphisms, which might make one person more vulnerable to developing a tumour than someone else. Now, the next question I might go to is about research, Kerry. So I'm not entirely sure what the person who was asking it really meant by the end of the question, but I'll maybe give Kerry a platform just to talk about research in general. So the question is, what research is done for tumours that can only be treated with oral medicine? So as Hao-Wen explained, there's certain reasons why temozolomide can be given orally, but I'll just sort of get Kerry to tell us a little bit about an overview of the big research questions that the neuro-oncology community is looking at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. A lot of the research we're doing at the moment is based on the molecular biology of the tumour, and I think there's some obvious things that we know. The first thing is that every patient is different, so that's one check. Every tumour is different, there's another check. And then we've got a blood-brain barrier that encases the tumour, so we have to look at things very differently. So you've got all these variables that we have to deal with. So a lot of the things that we're doing is, which Hao-Wen touched on the last slide, was personalised medicine. And that's where we use the genetics or the molecular biology of that tumour, and we look for drivers in that tumour. So it could be EGFR, it could be different other genes, and we try and come up with drugs that will target those treatments. And that's what's called personalised medicine and targeted treatment. The other thing that we're doing a lot of is immunotherapy, which is a growing field, particularly with brain cancer in this country. And that is actually getting your immune system to recognise the tumour and fight the tumour. And it's much less specific than targeted treatment. But again, as Hao-Wen alluded to, there's a whole different range of immunotherapies that we're trying to work out. Now, as a scientist, and the research that we're doing is trying to work out why is the brain tumour so resistant. And that's one of the problems, is that pharmacologists are coming up with new drugs all the time, but the brain cancer is still resisting those treatments, and that's what we've got to work out at the moment. So we're looking at things in immunotherapy that make the brain tumour what we call cold, and that's where the immunotherapy just doesn't wake up the tumour at all. And we're working out ways in which chemotherapies can work better as well, with DNA repair and things like that.
And Kerry, do you want to maybe talk about your upcoming study, the CMV vaccine study?
Yeah, so it's been a long wait, but what we're doing is working with Duke University, and this is where the barriers between Australia and international break down. If they've got something good, we'll do our best to bring it to Australia, and I think that's important to know. And so John Sampson at Duke University developed a peptide, which is a small little protein, and what it's doing is targeting cytomegalovirus. Now, cytomegalovirus, or CMV, is a very, very common bug It's a virus. And 60% in the general population has CMV, whether you like it or not. It doesn't do much. In immunosuppressed patients and newborns, yes, it can be a problem, but in the general population, it does nothing. So for some reason, the cytomegalovirus likes to live in the brain tumour. So the tumour has actually given the cytomegalovirus a really nice home to sit in. And so what we've done is we've actually used that cytomegalovirus as a homing device or a flag. And that says that I'm in the tumour, but I'm not in the normal brain. And so this trial is taking newly diagnosed GBM patients. We're going to give them a tetanus injection first, and that tetanus shot will actually boost the immune system. And then what we'll do is we'll vaccinate the patients with this little peptide against CMV, and then that will stimulate the immune system even further. So we're hoping to start that in the next few months. It's just, there is a hell of a lot of paperwork to go through, believe me. But yeah, we're really excited about it, and this trial is an Australian first.
While we're on this sort of topic, I might throw to Hao-Wen with the next question. Will immunotherapy work if a patient has autoimmune conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, thyroiditis? Is it worth trying in someone who has an existing autoimmune condition?
Yes, it's challenging. It's not so much an issue of, I think, whether it works, but in some cases whether the safety profile is worth trying to give immune therapy. Certainly in the pivotal clinical trials which looked at the benefit of immune therapy in other cancers, most of them are very strict and will exclude patients who have concomitant autoimmune disease. And for example, in melanoma, with those pivotal trials, they have a very strict selection criteria as to who's actually studied. I suppose in melanoma, they have a lot of experience with immune checkpoint inhibitors. I know in terms of general practice, if someone has a more sort of low-grade, lower-risk autoimmune disease, for example, controlled thyroiditis or maybe a low-grade rheumatoid, that sometimes if someone is a question about death versus trying a treatment, they may consider trying to do this, and there's a rate of causing a flare of the autoimmune disease. I think based on that experience, it's not a definite no, but definitely there's more risk and has to be considered when you're looking at treatment options.
Yeah, I've certainly heard some anecdotes in other cancers where I think people with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis can get really nasty flare-ups of their autoimmune colitis. So it's certainly something that needs to be done very carefully. And on clinical trials, it's probably a no. But as these drugs, if these drugs become more available, if they show efficacy, I imagine that there will be case-by-case decisions. So this is sort of slightly going over older ground, but maybe either you or Kerry might want to take this one on, Hao-Wen. Please explain T-cell therapy, opinion on is it successful and is it available in Australia? So I'm not quite sure if someone's asking about the CAR-T cells or whether it's more just a general question about immunotherapy, because there is something called CAR-T.
All right. So just imagine this is a scale. All right, so I've got a scale in my hand. So this is high feasibility, but maybe low penetrance, or maybe it won't work, but it's very feasible. Then you've got might work and hugely expensive and laborious. We've got peptides, which I just talked about, which are off the shelf. You can transport it, you can take it from country to country. Then you've got T-cell therapy. Now, the reason why T-cell therapy is out here is because you are central to that therapy. You're attached to the therapy. So that means that you have to go into hospital and you get bled like a guinea pig. And basically, it's called leukapheresis. And what they do is they take out your T cells. And this could be dendritic cell therapy, this could be T-cell therapy or CAR-T, or it could be BiTE therapy. And so you basically have a scientist working for you, you have a nurse working for you, you have a doctor working for you. It's a coordinated team effort to be able to develop these therapies. And then you need to be at that hospital site to then be re-injected with what your body has made. So that makes it hugely expensive, but also you can't travel. You know, you have to be at that site. So the problem that we have in Australia is that there's not many sites that actually have those facilities to do that sort of thing. So there's one in Melbourne at Weehai, there's one in Brisbane, but there's not that many of us that have those facilities. So we've been pushing the government to generate one of those facilities that we can have, particularly in New South Wales where it's absent. But the realistic cost value benefit is a very hard one to sell when it goes back to the Novo TTF problems of that you're looking at the hundreds to the $500,000, you know, $500,000 for an injection. It's a little bit hard to sell.
Howard, did you have anything else you wanted to add there?
Yes, so I would agree. I think we'll want to see that there was quite significant efficacy before we brought that technology across.
All right, moving to a different topic. So there's two questions, two different cards sort of about the same topic. So someone's recently saw an interview with a Turkish doctor about a cancer treatment clinic where there was a ketogenic diet being discussed, and it showed before and after photos with great success. I'm not sure if this was a brain tumour patient. Is there evidence for success of the ketogenic diet? And then a more general question from someone else, what role does diet play? So is there anyone that would like to take that question on?
No.
Don't all rush.
There are lots of things that appear on the internet or in often testimonials about patients that have done wonderfully well with treatments, and it's very enticing to want to do this. Unfortunately, the way that the medical community works is that we like to work on sort of evidence-based. So that means that the methodology should be understandable. It should have been there should have been a trial to show that this treatment actually works, and that needs to be a sort of a controlled trial rather than just having a testimonial of, I took X and I'm cured. Certainly for some brain tumour treatments that have been advocated, there's one for paediatric tumours that's been suggested by a group in Mexico, where patients go over with their families, they have this treatment. These people that are doing this treatment won't allow other people to see what they're doing. They won't tell people what they're doing. It hasn't been published. So people are very wary about that kind of treatment, and usually these treatments are very expensive. I don't know about ketogenic diets for brain tumours. Certainly for some kinds of epilepsy it works, but one's got to be really wary about things that you hear about, especially with testimonials. It's not saying it doesn't work, but it's really difficult to often go overseas, spend a lot of money on something that you're really not sure that it may or may not work. And they can have harms attached to them as well.
A ketogenic diet's very hard work.
Yeah, it is hard work.
You're monitoring your blood sugars, you're eating things you don't necessarily like, you're very restricted in your diet. I've certainly had a couple of my prostate cancer patients be on it, and I've had them faint in corridors, and you know, and I think, as Michael said, we're very much supporters of evidence-based medicine, and there just isn't that high level of evidence supporting that approach just at the moment. Stu, you're hovering near the mic.
Some general comments. I think that I understand the premise behind the question, and it is one about what can I control, what can I contribute, because if you're diagnosed with a brain tumour, that's beyond your control. And the treatments are to a large extent recommended, and people comply with their medical recommendations. And all of us here are traditionally or conservatively trained in a Western medicine paradigm. And so I think that I'm personally quite open-minded. I'm a believer in the concept of integrative medicine. I'm a believer in the contribution of diet, physical activity, exercise, all these things, the spiritual aspects, all of them together, I think. And us being health professionals, the last thing I would do is tell someone sort of what to do. So I understand where the question is coming from. But I also agree with Michael's comments that we just don't have the training or the expertise or the experience to give a judgment. And the framework by which we judge, is this treatment effective or is this diet effective, is a totally different framework, I think. And so I think we have to be careful about not judging. At the same time, I encourage my patients to honestly and openly disclose to their team what they're taking. We may not know the substance, but we could investigate it and see whether it interacts with traditional treatment, the potentials for harm in terms of increasing side effects or the potential to help. And I also think about the financial toxicity of alternative treatments, be they overseas or something local. And so I think there's a few issues there in the mix for consideration, but I do want to come back to the exercise piece and say that there is increasing evidence for the role of exercise, not just a gentle walk, but strenuous, both aerobic and resistance exercise in other cancer sites, lung, breast cancer, colon cancer, but also brain, and that is something very much that we can all control.
And if you speak to your doctors, they might be able to recommend an exercise physiologist. So it'd be good to sort of at least meet an exercise physiologist once, so you have a designed program. But Sue's been running an exercise study at Liverpool Hospital with newly diagnosed patients. So I'd certainly support Sue's comments there of the importance of exercise. All right, moving on to something else that's been in the news quite a bit is medicinal cannabis. So, cannabis oil. At what stage of disease should you think about taking it? How do you get it? How can medicinal cannabis help with treatment or tumour side effects? Why isn't it more available? So, anyone on the panel that would like to... Hawen, do you want to say anything about it?
That's yours.
I think it's similar to the issue with some of the complementary and alternative therapies. It hasn't yet been through that same rigorous scientific process, so we don't fully understand how effective or not this may be. I think that's why we've been quite cautious about it. There's certainly been a lot of anecdotal reports about some of the potential symptom benefits. So again, even there, it's not fully studied, but there may be some benefits in terms of energy or appetite management, and increasingly the expertise is being developed, and our palliative care colleagues have been looking into this, and some of them have quite a lot of experience with using it for those purposes. In terms of whether there's a specific anti-cancer effect, I'm not aware of any published trials that have rigorously studied that, so I think it's very hard to comment and to know whether that is the case, and I think that is why it's not widely available for that specific indication until the evidence becomes available.
Okay, any other comments from the panel about that? So there are clinics, so I know there's one across the road from Hawen at Sacred Heart Hospice. Professor Richard Chai runs a cannabis clinic, and there's someone at St George, Dr. Sheehan, who's got a clinic. So there certainly are clinics around the place. I think anecdotally, when we've discussed this at previous neuro-oncology meetings, we've heard from colleagues around Australia that they've had patients where the memory's been affected by the cannabis. Mood and sometimes personality. Some patients can develop paranoia. So it's not necessarily a benign substance. There certainly seems to be a high level of evidence for cannabis oil, say in the complex childhood epileptic syndromes, than there is in cancer. But obviously there are some patients that swear by it in terms of their sleep or appetite. But I don't think we've had anything yet about anti-cancer properties that would make us sit up and take notice just yet.
There's certainly evidence in vitro that it may have some effect in some cancers, but that's in vitro in cells in a dish. Another problem with cannabis is that it's not a single substance. It's a group of many different compounds, and the compounds and the various things that are used in trials are mixtures of compounds, and they're not standardised. So when somebody is on cannabis treatment, you're not really quite sure what they're on. Now, the main one that people know about is the one that has the psychotropic effects. But there are a lot of other parts of the cannabis plant that have biologically active chemicals that don't give you the psychological effects. So people have been looking at different components of cannabis to see if those will work. But as has been said, there are no clinical trials in people that have shown a benefit, as far as I'm aware. And also, reiterating what was said before, it's really important that you tell your clinicians if you are on other things, including cannabis, because they may interact with the treatments that you're getting.
Okay. Jonathan, someone's asked a question about wafers, I assume Glidel wafers. So tell us, it's about wafers put in during surgery. So what's the role of that?
Yeah, so as we've talked about, the problem, some of the problems with brain tumours is getting drugs across the blood-brain barrier, and also the tumour recurring or progressing fairly locally. So there was probably, I guess, about 10 or so years ago, a technology where wafers were put in the brain which had chemotherapy in them, and it was around the same time as temozolomide coming along. So in the end, it was quite clear that temozolomide was of greater benefit and certainly of less risk. So the main problem with these wafers was that they caused seizures and brain swelling and fluid leaking from the brain and all sorts of bad things. So it was as much putting the wafers in the head that was the problem as anything else. Now, the chances are with some of these nanoparticles and things like that, that something will come along that may be of benefit. So and that's just because the problem is one of getting adequate drugs and adequate response at the site of where the tumour is. So I hope, there may be something more that comes up, but at the moment that sort of the wafer technology that we were using, which was called Glidel, was it just really caused more problems than it solved. So it sort of went out of favour quite quickly.
Yeah, there were two other challenges with it. It was on the PBS, which meant it couldn't be given in the state hospitals, because the state hospitals don't necessarily have PBS drugs, because it's a different sort of payment mechanism. So it meant it could be given in private hospitals but not public hospitals. And they also had wording that if you used Glidel, you couldn't get temozolomide. So it was kind of one or the other. So so I think most people sort of voted with their feet and just stayed with the so-called STUP protocol. Desma, did you have a question?
Is this working? Okay. My question was for the cannabis. Most people actually go down the cannabis oil path if the patient has a lot of seizures. I think that's where it kind of begins and why they start looking for a way forward. Have you guys heard of anything in terms of the cannabis oil helping with seizures, or is there a better treatment that people should ask their clinician for?
Howen or John?
I think, I would say, again, during my overseas fellowship in Canada, where cannabis is actually quite accessible, anecdotally, you would have people where seemingly after taking it, it might be better. It's just very hard to know whether that's a consistent effect or not. I think it's not. There are many treatments for managing seizures, and I think in the majority of cases, with titration of standard anti-epileptics like Keppra or introduction of secondary anti-seizure medications, in the vast majority of cases, you'll be able to get good control with that. And so, it'd be the rare case, maybe a low-grade glioma. It would be a rare case where you're really struggling and have nothing else to offer.
I think the most important for patients who have seizures is to be linked in with an epilepsy service, and a lot of the tertiary hospitals have dedicated epilepsy neurologists who can monitor seizures and make sure that people are on a cocktail of drugs with the least amount of side effects. But I'd agree with you, Desma, and certainly that's where cannabis sort of got back into the picture, with particularly some of those really complex childhood epilepsy syndromes where young patients were having 30 fits a day, and certain types of cannabis seem to really make a difference. We've got a question now about what are methylated tumours. So perhaps either Kerry or Michael might want to have a word about what a methylated tumour is and what that means.
Right. Okay. So what methylation means is it basically is a stop on the protein. So MGMT is one of those things that we call methylated or unmethylated. So MGMT is a DNA repair gene. We don't particularly want that DNA repair gene, so it gets turned off by methylation, and then that's associated with better response. Most patients, unfortunately, are unmethylated, so they don't have that block, and so the protein gets expressed. So that's what methylation means. Now, methylation is different in all sorts of cancers. So in GBM, we typically have MGMT methylation, which is what we call a methylated cancer in general. But if you apply that to a low-grade tumour, they tend to be highly methylated, and they've got this thing called a GSIMP, which is a lot of genes that are methylated, that are blocked. And that, unfortunately, means a lot of the tumour suppressors are blocked. So that's what happens with methylation. And then in kids' cancers, they're known to be a disease of methylation now. That is what's caused their disease. So we use the term methylation very loosely, but it can mean different things depending on what type of tumour you've got.
Yeah, so often it comes up in conversation with, say, something like temozolomide. If a tumour is methylated, that means that the damage that the radiation and the chemotherapy do to the tumour is less likely to be repaired by the cancer cell. So it's an advantage to the patient. And there are some controversies about how to measure it. And again, this is a test not reimbursed by the government. And there's different labs and different scientists disagree about, I guess, the gold standard. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about that, Kerry, about the way it's...
Yeah.
Okay.
We have our fights in the lab.
Yeah. All right. And how does Avastin target the tumour? And oh, sorry. Yep. Desmond?
No, I don't. That's all right. You sure?
We can come back to you if you think of it. Okay. So.
How does Avastin target the tumour? I mean, the general mechanism is that it will block something called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, which is needed for new blood vessel growth. And I guess the cell activity for tumours is that these are tumours that are rapidly growing, they need lots of nutrients, and therefore they're forming new blood vessels. So hopefully these are the ones that are most affected. I guess also these tumours often have more brittle, abnormal blood vessels, so maybe these are the ones that might be more susceptible to this drug. But it's not a perfect selective treatment, and therefore the side effects that can come from Avastin relate to the potential effects on other parts of the normal vasculature. And so, for example, blood pressure often can increase because of the effects on the blood vessels. Sometimes the kidneys might become more leaky because of the fine blood vessels in the kidneys causing proteinuria. It's a slightly increased risk of clotting and bleeding events on Avastin. That all relates to the irritability of normal blood vessels. So yes, it's meant to be more selective, but it's not perfect either.
Yeah, so Avastin hasn't been shown to improve survival, which is why it's not on the PBS. And there's, as Howard mentioned earlier, a cost share program, which is a little bit different to a compassionate program. We'll come to you right next. So that someone in the audience has asked, how does compassionate pharmaceuticals work? Right to try, etc. So any comments about some of the compassionate programs out there?
So as you mentioned, Avastin is cost share, so you would have to pay for the first 12 weeks of treatment, and if you were still benefiting after that period, you can then access the drug free as part of that program. And I guess that the company who has that program are hoping that at some point that the drug will be part of the standard treatment that will be reimbursed. That's kind of the motivation to have this program available. I guess the same principle with compassionate programs. If there's some promise, if the company thinks that this drug might eventually make it to market and be something useful to build experience in the community, they might, in certain circumstances, be happy to provide a drug in a specific case. It might be a case-by-case basis for some certain drugs.
So I think in the glioblastoma setting, ABT414 is sometimes provided compassionately for people who overexpress a particular protein called EGFR. Question over there.
On follow-up to the question asked about research, has there or is there being research done on what effect epileptic medication has on a person that has been taking it for long term? I'm talking over 30 years, or over 50 years, which is very uncommon now, 50 years, but it is being done now, people on it for over 50 years.
I don't know if I can answer it. It's a good question, but to my knowledge, I think you've touched on a point that I think scientists in cancer research and scientists in neurology, we don't talk to each other, we don't like each other. And that's bad. That is really bad, because they've got this great knowledge of the brain, and we really need to encourage that interaction much more. And I think it's a great question, but I actually don't know the answer.
I think it's yeah. Again, I don't know the specific answer, but to say that there's obviously been an evolution and advancement in anti-seizure drugs, similar to surgery and radiation over the last number of decades, so that the older drugs, some of those older ones, are now no longer used, in part because of recognition about the whole range of side effects on, say, liver function and other functions, the need for blood monitoring, and we use sort of newer drugs that are a little, shall we say, cleaner to use. So there's definitely been advancements, but as I guess I was saying in my presentation, in respect to, you know, cognitive late effects, it's very hard to distill the effects of treatment, medications, and the ageing effect, and the effects of the brain tumour out, because in a sense they all sort of intermingled together.
And one interesting thing about epilepsy drugs is some of them induce metabolic enzymes. So it probably meant that in the past, patients who were on certain anticonvulsant drugs were metabolising their chemotherapy a bit quicker than other patients, and maybe the drug level wasn't as high. So I think we only really understood that, you know, sort of 5-10 years later, that actually patients on certain drugs should have different dose levels of their chemotherapy drugs.
New medication, different groups of medication, through different areas of them. So,
Yeah. So I think, as Stu said, there's been...
The new ones did make a lot of difference in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of advances, so important to check back in with a neurologist, not just the GP, to see if certain drugs should be sort of recalibrated. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but that's because we started a little bit late. So we've just got a couple of quick questions. We'll just rush through these because they should be relatively quick. What is a contrast enhanced? I think it must mean MRI, but someone's written MRV, so if I've got the question wrong, jump in. So, Jonathan, do you want to just quickly explain what a contrast enhanced MRI is?
Yeah, so, and that can be, so basically an agent is given, it's basically a compound that's given intravenously. So in CT scan and in X-ray, they use things with iodine in them that can then be seen on X-ray. In MRI, they use a thing called gadolinium. And basically, in the context of brain, and then they do scans before and after you have that injection. In brain tumours, the context of it is that a lot of tumours cause breakdown of the blood-brain barrier that we've talked about. So it just basically means that the tumours will then take up this contrast agent and then appear different to normal brain around. Or there's quite a few circumstances in which things will enhance with contrast. It doesn't just mean tumour, it can happen in infection, it can happen in radiation necrosis, it can happen in a bunch of other clinical conditions, but it just basically reflects a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier. Now, if the question is about MRV, so
Yep.
there are actual tests where MRV stands for MR, which is magnetic resonance venogram. So we do MRAs, which are MR arteriograms, and so they're looking at the veins or the arteries. So, for example, some examples where I might have a patient have an MRA is to see if they have an aneurysm on one of their blood vessels or something like that. A situation where we might use MRV is, say, a tumour like a meningioma, maybe where it's located, it might be next to one of the big main veins that drain the brain. And so we may want to see if that vein's still patent or if there's other veins that have opened up. So it's very sort of patient-specific how useful those tests are.
Okay. There's a question here about recurrent glioblastoma. So someone's written an example of someone who had 22 cycles of temozolomide, had another surgery, they went on to irinotecan, and a question about what the options of treatment are when irinotecan stops working. So Helen, if you just want to give a very brief answer to that.
Yes, I guess the challenge is once temozolomide has become ineffective, there isn't a clear second or third choice. So irinotecan would be one potential option. You might try lomustine, you might try procarbazine, you might try etoposide. These are different chemotherapies which in a certain person might work. It's just very hard to know which one to guess. And I guess increasingly we're looking at these personalised or immune therapeutics. If there are clinical trials around, we're always looking to see if there are novel treatments that might be an alternative option.
There's a question here about an agent, I don't know if I've read about it with a different name, ONC201. Can you expand on ONC201 as an agent, and when will we know the results of it?
Yeah, I know ONC201.
Good on you, Kerry.
ONC201 is actually a dopamine antagonist. And
What antagonist?
dopamine.
Dopamine, right.
Okay, and it's used. There's in paediatric tumours in particular, and in younger adult patients, there's a histone that gets mutated, and it's called a H3 mutation or a histone 3 mutation. And ONC201 is actually being used specifically for these types of tumours. And the animal models looked great, looked really interesting. And it's just gone into a phase 1, phase 2 study at the moment. And it's got good penetration into the brain, and hopefully it will be good.
Okay. This is a question where I'm scratching my head. So someone's written that there's an example of someone with a tumour on the left side. Would this cause pain down the left side of the body from head to toe? Now, generally, when a tumour's on the left side, it actually weakens the right side of the body. Obviously, people might be on medications, etc. But does anyone in the audience have a putative mechanism why a left-sided tumour might cause pain down the left side of the body?
But it's no is a short answer. I mean, it could be something else. Generally, all the structures in the brain are, there's parts where they cross twice, particularly the cerebellum, but generally, if there's a problem that you perceive on the left or is seen on the left, it reflects a right brain problem.
So I guess you would think probably a different pathologic process. Sometimes if someone has very unusual pains, you might think about leptomeningeal spurt or something a bit more unusual.
All right, so I'll move to the last card before we move on to the next section of the day. So is there a blood test for detection? Is there a way to detect a brain tumour? The answer to that, unfortunately, is no. It's not like ovarian cancer where there's a tumour marker called CR125.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. And we don't have PSA like the prostate cancer patients. But Kerry, if you wanted to give a quick answer about efforts in this area.
Yeah, I think particularly with immunotherapy, there will be a blood test if I have my way. Basically, the blood, you take the blood, and part of those cells are immune cells, and we can detect the levels using really sensitive methods. The other thing too that I know some of the labs in Australia have been really pushing forward is exosomes that are lysed off into the blood. And exosomes carry some part of the tumour as well, and that can be detected in the blood. So it's early days, but we're very hopeful that for 2 indications that there will be a blood test that you can have.
And Kerry, the last question of the panel I think probably goes to you and or Michael. Brain tumour banks. Does all research have access, and where did my tumour go?
As far as I know, in New South Wales, yes, your tumour would have been banked. It's very rare for sites not to buy a bank anymore. We've come together and we've formed this alliance or consortium called the Australian Biobanking. What was it?
Brain Cancer Biobanking
Australia.
BCBA.
BCBA.
Which Robin Leonard leads. Yep.
Yeah, that's not good, is it? But basically what we're trying to do is I might have my collection, Jonathan's got his collection, someone else has got another collection. let's stop looking at these little collections that mean nothing and bring everything together and hit brain cancer hard. And that's what biobanking's all about.
Yeah, so there are, as Kerry says, there's efforts so that even if a particular tissue is housed in a different lab, that the various sort of stakeholders can work together and collaborate. And there was another project that Kerry was very involved with called AGOG, where tumours were banked. So it is certainly something that's very important. The most important thing, though, about that tissue is for it to go to someone like Michael, though, to diagnose the patient. So that's always the priority, is to get a good bit of tissue so that you get the correct, the correct answer in terms of what type of subtype of brain tumour you have, and then it's other extra tissue which can then go to the biobanks. And some labs, I think, for example, in Western Australia, it might stay in the original lab, but they might identify a section of tumour in the tissue they have in the lab to say, H7, if there's any research down the track, H7's the bit of tumour that should go to that kind of research. So I think there's certainly a lot more conversations between surgeons, scientists, neuropathologists to make sure that we get the best bang for our buck in terms of the tissue, so that we can do the best for the individual patient, but also learn as much as we can for the benefit of everybody. I'm going to bring the panel to a close. I'd like to thank our fantastic panel. So John Parkinson, Hao Sim, Kerry McDonald, Michael Rodriguez and Sue Ko. What a wonderful panel. I'd also like to thank you all for your questions. I think this is the most questions we've ever had. So thank you for being engaged and asking fabulous questions. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague John Parkinson, who was my predecessor at the New South Wales Neuro-Oncology Group as the chair, who's going to be taking over for the launch component of today's events.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for running the panel in. That was excellent. So my next task for today is something that I undertook as the chair of the New South Wales Neuro-Oncology Group, and something I feel very privileged to have been involved with, as I was as I think this is we've developed some fantastic resources for patients, and hopefully something that we'll see used quite widely. Essentially, Brain Tumour Alliance Australia, or BTAA, were successful in obtaining a project grant from Cancer Australia in 2016, and essentially this came about through looking at resources available for people with different language backgrounds, so English as a second language backgrounds, such that we were able to develop some resources for brain tumour patients that were are now available in 10 other languages. So the way it sort of evolved, and I was on the steering committee of this, was that we saw the opportunity to develop resources that actually would be useful for in English as well as the second languages. So as much as we've, I really feel like this is a really good utilisation of the funds and the opportunity, because we've created resources that I think will be very widely applicable to brain tumour patients. So what we've basically done is come up with some resources, and I'll try and just project these up on the screen, that really do help to sort of navigate the brain tumour journey, if you will. So first of all, let me just make sure this pops up there. Lots of what we found, and a lot of the feedback we received, and the resolution's not perfect on that, so I apologise about that. But what we found is a lot of patients got a lot of information about their tumour and about their treating team, and didn't have a quite kind of a neat way to bring it all together. So the first thing we did was come up with this resource, which is basically a single page that talks about, just as a place in which to hold all the information that type of tumour, what that means in terms of the grade, some of the other important tumour features that may, such as the things with some of the molecular testing we've been talking about this morning, some of the treatments and side effects, even just on this little picture here, just drawing where the tumour is, what the frontal lobe means or the temporal lobe means. And then obviously what sort of treatment a patient has had or will be having if they're involved in a trial, seizure management and other medications. At the bottom we've put just a few sources of help, so resources, support resources and information resources. And then on this side we obviously have the ability just to write down, who the members of the treating teams are. So who the neurosurgeon is and an oncologist, etc. Because often you see different people when you're in the hospital, registrars and fellows and all of that sort of thing, as well as seeing, but knowing, A, who the person is who's kind of in charge, and B, how to get hold of them, we thought was really useful. The second thing, second part of that resource was to look at the sort of pathway that, I guess, again, the journey that most brain tumour patients go through. So looking at, where the diagnosis is, just commenting on how there's a review of each individual, but often that happens behind the scenes. I think lots of people don't realise how often we talk to each other. Ongoing scans, treatments, and then how things might go if there is, some change. That means that, what options are there when we look, when tumours do progress or occur. And then beyond that, the other sort of supportive care side of things, so focusing on, I guess, the clinical care and the supportive care, so what practical support there is, what support there is for carers, rehab, self-care and wellness and all those sort of things. And these resources have been developed, and we developed them in English, and then they've been translated into 10 additional languages. And I'll show you the list of languages in a moment. So I think this in itself is just fantastic. For someone like me, who's often the first person to speak to someone about a brain tumour diagnosis, to be able to sort of have a piece of paper and sit down and go, look, this is what this is where we're at. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is the team. This is what this test. These are the few tests that people are going to ask you these questions, I think is a really, really valuable thing. The next resource that we developed or redeveloped is a better way to say it, and then had translated was a book that was written by I'm just trying to think of what her title is. Danette Langbecker, who's a researcher in the area of supportive care in Queensland. She'd written this book. It's been available. It was revised and updated because, as we've seen this morning, treatment and pathways have been revised all the time. So this is a booklet of, I'm not sure how many pages is it roughly? 34. Okay, that's been with a whole bunch of, as we sort of said leading into the panel, everyone has questions. Questions are, there's no such thing as silly questions, and the main reason is to show people that it is okay to ask questions, and as doctors and clinicians, we're expecting you to ask questions, and there's often the questions that you have are questions that everyone has, and when they're not, and everyone's there to work, for you. So, and again, so this has been revised and also then translated into the 10 languages, and it doesn't really project very well. Sorry about that. But there are also some videos that have been placed online. There's some more information about that outside. But basically, the documents and the videos are in these 10 languages here: Arabic, Chinese, Dari, Filipino, Greek, Hindi, Italian, Vietnamese, Punjabi, and Spanish. So we feel that that this has really provided us a very good opportunity to be able to help improve the brain tumour journey for a vast number of patients in Australia. And personally, I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to be involved with this, and I think everyone has. So if you want any more information about these resources, then the BTAA stand outside has some examples, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions, as would Tricia and Catherine and everyone from BTAA. So next, I'd like to get the Cancer Australia perspective on this from Dr. Helen Zorbas. So if you can come up to the stage, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be here in person with you all this afternoon. It is afternoon now, isn't it? I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. So I was really very engaged in the session. I'm glad I was able to come here a bit earlier and hear that Q&A, and particularly so as I was actually, I still am, I think, on the Minister's Steering Group on medicinal cannabis. So I do encourage you to have a look at the TGA website, which will have which does have the analysis of the very detailed evidence review that was undertaken, where there was evidence, and gives an analysis of where there might be some benefit or not at this point in time for different uses of medicinal cannabis. I'm also delighted to sort of add, in terms of context, to let you know, I'm sure you do know, that the Medical Research Future Fund, which is a huge investment across governments, we hope, of any colour, have established an Australian brain cancer mission, which was the first mission as part of the Medical Research Future Fund investment, and Cancer Australia is overseeing that investment. It's currently at $124.7 million, and that's bringing together federal government money with philanthropy and other governments' money, other research organisations. It brings clinicians and patients around the table. There is a research strategy to inform that investment over time. So again, if you're interested in knowing a bit more about that, there's Cancer Australia website. Look up Australian Brain Cancer Mission. But that's not really what I came to talk about. It's really around these resources, which are really fabulous to be here to launch today. We all know, particularly people in this room, the considerable burden that brain cancer, brain tumours place not only on those diagnosed, but also on the families and carers of those people, but also on the community more broadly. This year, it's estimated that there'll be almost 2,000 new diagnoses of brain cancer in Australia, and the young are disproportionately affected by brain cancer because it's the leading cause of cancer-related death in those under 25 years of age. Unfortunately, as we all know, the road ahead for those people is very challenging, as well as for those around them that are providing care and support. There are significant tumour and treatment-related effects, and we've heard about that today, which impact on cognitive and physical functioning. And in addition to that, there's also the emotional overlay, the fear of recurrence, and the huge toll of having a poor prognosis cancer where survival rates are low and have remained relatively unchanged over time. And that's a very harsh reality to face. So as a clinician, I have seen the impact of brain cancer, but I've also experienced the impact of this disease on a personal level. I've seen a very talented and vibrant colleague with a young family tragically lose his life to brain cancer. And just last month, a very close friend of mine lost her 26-year-old son. 6 years ago, I lost my mother to GBM. And that 15-month journey was difficult for her, but also for all of us who loved and cared for her. She was a very vibrant, physically and mentally highly active woman, and there was so much to navigate and coordinate in accessing treatment across systems and with a number of different clinicians. There's also the emotional toll when the disease progressed. This was further compounded by the fact that English was not my mother's first language. And for all these reasons, I'm especially pleased to participate in the launch of these information resources in different languages to help and support people affected by brain cancer and their carers. I'd like to particularly congratulate the Brain Tumour Alliance of Australia for bringing together the consortium, and also obviously to congratulate the partners who came together with Brain Tumour Alliance of Australia for the production of these invaluable resources to inform and support Australia's multicultural population. At the time of diagnosis, when your world suddenly seems so out of control, having quality, accessible information in your language to support your understanding of the disease and to help you interact more effectively with your treatment team is so empowering. I had the opportunity to look at these resources before today, and It's Okay to Ask booklet just does that. It empowers the person to ask the questions that it is okay to ask those questions. The other resource, the My Brain Tumour Pathway, helps patients and their carers to map where they're at in the journey and what happens next. Again, this is so important. Knowing that there's a plan, knowing who to call for help, really provides a sense of control and comfort in what can otherwise feel like a very uncoordinated experience. And then the video of patient stories is such an important resource, I think, for newly diagnosed patients with high-grade glioma. It's a very traumatic and confronting time. Being able to connect and hear from someone who has trodden that path in their own language is a powerful way not only of providing information and support, but also hope. So Cancer Australia is really pleased to have supported the development of these resources that are now available in 10 languages, as you've heard, through our Supporting People with Cancer grant initiative. The aim of this initiative is to reduce the burden of cancer through the provision of grants in areas of identified need. And to date, Cancer Australia has awarded 110 of these grants at over $8.8 million. These grants also aim to encourage effective partnerships between organisations to improve outcomes for Australians affected by cancer. The partnership approach is critical to improving outcomes, and it certainly was embraced in the development of these resources, reflecting involvement of consumers, health professionals and community organisations working together. So congratulations to all the partners who worked so passionately and collaboratively. The Brain Tumour Alliance Australia, the University of Queensland, Queensland University of Technology, the Olivia Newton-John Cancer and Wellness Centre, Austin Health in Melbourne, the New South Wales Neuro-Oncology Group, Grey Matters, the International Brain Tumour Alliance, the Sydney Brain Tumour Support Group, Polaron Melbourne, Nemix Melbourne, Sigwinetti Media, Bartercard Canberra, Judith Micklejohn, the Chinese Cancer Society of Victoria, and most importantly, brain tumour patients and carers. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the very integral and unique contribution that the involvement of consumers, people affected by the disease, can make towards improving both the experience and outcomes for others. So thank you for the courage and the generosity of consumers who participated in developing these resources. This strong and meaningful engagement and the powerful insights that you shared will assist in ensuring that the resources meet the needs of people affected by brain cancer. Once again, I'm delighted to participate in this launch today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Not only in your role as the CEO of Cancer Australia, but also for sharing those personal insights. And I think that was very kind and much appreciated by all. Next, I'd like to ask Marina Castellan to come to the stage. She's a care coordinator who I work with at Royal North Shore, and she's often the one who fields a lot of the inquiries about the brain tumour journey, and she should. I'd like to hear her comments on these new resources.
So these resources, I'm really happy about these resources because we don't have a lot of resources that are specific to primary brain tumours. So it's really something that's been coming for a while, and I really congratulate BTAA and all the collaborators that worked on this. In the past, what I've done when I've met people is write things down for them and handed them bits of paper so to actually have something that looks this great for them to take away and actually process down the track is a good thing. I think when people are diagnosed, the information's overwhelming, it's confusing, the pathway's confusing. So to have something to take away that you can, nut out down the track and come back and actually write your questions down is a really valuable thing. What I've tended to do in the past as well is actually try and Google translate some of the information for patients. So to have, these resources in other languages is a fantastic thing as well. And the only other thing I wanted to say, that I find a lot in the work that I do is, where you get people that you'll meet them down the track and you'll ask them what type of tumour they have and they actually won't know. So to have it written down, that they can present it to another medical person because the team is vast sometimes and you are going between different doctors, so that I think is a great asset for the group of patients we see.
Thank you, Marina. So I think that just leaves us with Catherine. Catherine's the chair of BTAA, and I can probably just plug that in for you. Issues here. Do you have a...
No. What I was going to do, 2 days ago we launched our new website, and I was going to show you how easy it is for patients.
We can do it on mic.
Oh, okay, yeah. Perfect.
Just clear my browsing history.
Just while we're doing this, I would like to, as everyone's been mentioned who was involved, but one person in particular has led this project for the last 3 years, and it's my colleague Trish Berman. And if it hadn't have been for her, this wouldn't have happened. She's managed to get everyone involved and has driven it, has negotiated with Cancer Australia as things changed, and a huge, huge thank you.
Yeah, I'd agree. No, it's all. There you go.
So this is our new website.
Sorry. There you go. You have to look up.
Oh, there, okay. And the company that's developed this for us said, oh no, it's going to take a couple of months. And Trish said, we've got to have it for today. So they've worked very, very hard. On the front page, there's this a caption there, and it'll always have the latest news. At the moment, it's got our new resources, and it's purely a matter of Where have I gone? Sorry. And it clicks onto that page. And there, it's so easy to see. I'll click into one of them if I... You might be... Oh. It's like operating, isn't it?
Harder.
Yeah, I'd love you to. Just do it up to Chinese or something, just on one of the languages.
All right, so you got the videos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The videos only went on this morning, I think it was.
And then the pathways.
And they're able to be printed off. So the doctors, we're not producing printed copies because, you know, Jonathan might only have one person a year. So, but if he has someone come into his room, he can print these things off and tell the patient about them. And our challenge now is to make sure everyone around Australia, all the clinicians, know about the resources so they can use them. And that was literally all I wanted to say, just to see where they were and let you have a visual look at them. But thank you all for...
That's fine, that's fine. Well, thanks, Catherine, and thanks everyone. Once again, you know, I'd echo Catherine's comments about Tricia and her role in this because she certainly was the one who brought it all together, and I'm sure she's both excited and relieved about this happening today. That concludes the morning session. We'll be back at 1:15 after lunch. Any questions for any of the speakers? You know, lunchtime's always a good time to ask, and we'll see you again shortly. Oh, yeah. Kerry's gone.